Bill Meyer with the Michigan Peace Council, which is a chapter of the U.S. Peace Council, the oldest peace council and the largest one in the world. And we hope you are a member, or at least a follower of us, and you're on our mailing list so you can join us for other activities. This first question is simply to identify who our friends are up here. They're going to describe the group they work with, or the groups they work with, how they work through in the area of anti-imperialism, and a little bit about themselves so we get to know each other, because this is how the whole thing grows. It's not just groups, it's human beings that have to work with each other, and we want to know about each other to find ways to bond and connect with each other in our work. So we're going to start out with Catherine Wilkerson for this first question. Catherine is an activist affiliated with the Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War, also the Washington Reds Socialist Group, and the Michigan Peace Council. She's on our board with the Michigan Peace Council. She's been involved in struggles against war, racism, and imperialism since 1967. Her views expressed today, she may ask me to say this, are her own, and they're not intended to necessarily represent those of any groups that she's affiliated with. She's going to speak independently. So let's give a nice round of applause and welcome Carolyn Wilkerson.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone coming out today. I am wearing this red hat not only because I'm a red, but because I don't have any power in my house and my hair looks horrible. So I'm covering it up with a red hat today for both reasons. Because we live in an advanced society where we can't keep the power on when a storm hits. So I hope all of you are staying warm, and I hope that my power is on when I get back to Ann Arbor. I was involved in kind of resurrecting the Ann Arbor Coalition Against the War a year ago, right before the beginning of the special military operation in the Ukraine. And I have been loosely affiliated with them off and on over the past year. Before that, and throughout the last number of years, I've been involved with a socialist group called the Washington Reds. And we, at this point, are focusing on study and discussion of socialist texts, and then I'm a member of the Michigan Peace Council. I think what's informing my understanding of Unite Against Imperialism right now is a couple of things. I've been following the International People's Tribunal on U.S. imperialism that's taking place. This is a really important project. It's going on for 6 months. And the last session was on Korea, and about once a month it is addressing another country that is suffering under U.S. imperialism. It specifically is addressing unilateral economic coercive measures, also known as sanctions. And the last, it's going to conclude at the Simón Bolívar Institute in Caracas in June. Wish I could go. It's probably going to be amazing. The other thing that I have found really interesting that has informed how I'm looking at this issue today is an article that I'm going to mention a little bit here today from the January edition of Monthly Review by Pavel Vargan, and we talked about this at a recent meeting of the Washington Reds, and it turned out to be a very interesting discussion, and that is called NATO and the Long War in the Third World. And it also, in both of these instances, it's a very international perspective on the question of how we fight imperialism. I think that we all recognize at this point that since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the United States is the hegemonic power in the world. It is the imperialist power, and what we mean by that is, I guess we're probably going to talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially the stage of capitalism, which is dominated by monopolies and export of capital, exploitation of targeted countries around the world, where the capitalist power, in this case primarily the United States, is able to exploit the workers, get land and resources at lower prices, and then that way to enhance the profits of the capitalist. And so that is the way I'm focusing on this issue primarily. We know that imperialism will employ violence when necessary, but it's at this point usually through economic control of the countries that are targeted. I guess we'll talk some more about that as we go on. So that's enough for right now.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much, Catherine Wilkerson. So next person who's going to speak is ABAYOMI. We've known him for many years. He's everywhere. He's a great activist. He's involved with many groups. Today he represents the Communist Workers League, but he'll explain that. He has a long bio, but I'm going to narrow this down to just a few brief things. He's editor of the Pan-African Newswire. He's a co-founder of the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality, the Michigan Emergency Committee Against the War and Injustice, the Moratorium Now Coalition to Stop Foreclosures, Evictions, and Utility Shutoffs, and others. He's a broadcast journalist for the last 22 years. He's been on Press TV and RT many times, a couple of my favorite sources for news. He's appeared on numerous television and radio networks, including Al Jazeera and BBC and NPR and many others. So we're very honored to have him here with us today. He's probably walked here. I think he's one of our local guys. So thank you, ABAYOMI. Let's give him the next one.
Thank you so much, Bill, and it's good to be out, see so many people out this afternoon in downtown Detroit to discuss these important world issues. Since this is African American History Month in the United States, I will utilize this fact to illustrate the necessity of building unity against imperialism. Now, many African American historians, such as Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who started African American History Month way back in 1926 as Negro History Week, and others, such as Dr. W.B. Du Bois, Shirley Graham Du Bois. We could point to people such as Ida B. Wells Barnett, among others, always brought a critical approach to the importance of discounting and exposing and deconstructing the myths and the ideological platitudes of the United States in regard to both its domestic as well as its foreign policy. And that is true if we look at the actual history of the United States. For example, even with the Civil War that was fought 160 years ago, it still did not resolve the question of racism. It did not fully liberate the African American people. Jim Crow was reinstituted in the United States during the late 19th century and the 20th century. This took place along the same lines as you saw the growth in U.S. imperialism. The Spanish-American War at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. We could talk about the first imperialist war of 1914 to 1918. Talk about the Second World War of 1939 to 1945. All of these wars did not liberate humanity from imperialism, colonialism, and racism. There's a struggle that still needs to be waged. And of course, if we look in the 20th and 21st century, we can count so many wars. I have some of them written down here. I mentioned World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, wars and occupations against Haiti, the destruction of Libya, the partial destruction of Syria, and now the destruction of Ukraine. Now, most of these wars have enhanced the social status, has not enhanced the social status of African American people. In fact, the situation is quite to the contrary. When we look at the post-war periods in U.S. history, there have been a degree of repression and reaction that have resulted from them. Look at the aftermath of World War I. You had the so-called Red Summer of 1919, where African American communities were attacked across the United States by white mobs, by the police, by National Guard and even federal troops. After World War II, we saw a surge in lynchings and other forms of repression that coincided with the Cold War, which was designed to solidify U.S. hegemony in the aftermath of World War II. So the question is, how does the situation today in Ukraine, in the Asia Pacific involving the People's Republic of China, how does that relate to the previous wars that we've had to struggle against over the last few decades? And I would venture to say that this war is no different fundamentally than the other wars that have been fought in Vietnam, all throughout Southeast Asia, the support of U.S. imperialism for the reactionary forces in Southern Africa. The U.S. was on the other side in Angola, in Namibia, in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, in Libya. So I just wanted to make that clear that we do not see a disruption in regard to the rationale, the reasoning, and the impulses of U.S. imperialism in Eastern Europe over the last year than what we've seen throughout the global South, and also what we see daily in regard to repression against African Americans and other oppressed people in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ABAYOMI, AZIKIWE. I always have trouble saying your last name. Is AZIKIWE? That sounds good. Okay, cool. After all these years, I got to get it right. Now we have two guests here who are who more or less represent issues, country issues. And this is a friend from that works in China. This is a friend from the Philippines. So their reports are going to be a little different, maybe more focused on their issue. And so I'd like to introduce you to a gentleman I just met myself. His name is Steve BOYCE. He's with the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. He's a retired public school teacher living in Ann Arbor, and during his tenure there, he worked with the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan, as well as conducting independent research in South China on the teaching of English in the People's Republic. In his last year in public schools, he was a fellow teacher with the Center for South Asia Studies at UM, and in that capacity visited India and Nepal with a delegation of teachers. He's also a veteran of the U.S. Army, where he served immediately after high school at the end of the Vietnam era. So this is Steve BOYCE from the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. Let's welcome him.
Thank you so much for your invitation to speak here. I'm very happy to join you here at the site of Occupy Detroit, right across over there. My fond memories. And what you may not have known was that during that time period in China, there were spontaneous demonstrations of people, not organized by the government, who gathered in public squares with signs and banners proclaiming their solidarity with the revolutionary youth of the United States and their struggle against imperialism and the capitalism of Wall Street. You've heard all about the dissidents from Hong Kong that lament the fact that Britain didn't take over all of China, or the kids who don't like government policy now. What you don't know is there are many, many people in China that are proud of its revolutionary past and believe that the struggle to build a new China is not just built on becoming rich and powerful, but on serving the people. The U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, the impetus started in 1971 when a bunch of young radicals who had been to China at the invitation of the Chinese Communist Party came back and decided to get a national solidarity organization to unite the American people and the Chinese people and get over the decades of racist propaganda that had painted the Chinese people, as well as the Chinese state, our mortal enemy. An enemy that we fought 3 wars against. At the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War from 1946 to 49, in Korea, and in Vietnam, which was a proxy war against China in which 58,000 members of the People's Liberation Army formed the entire North Vietnamese air defense setup during that war against American B-52 bombers. They started a national organization in 1974. focused on bringing people-to-people connections to overcome these differences, to show our solidarity, and to stand in support of the Chinese people, and to change this notion that China was our mortal and unforgivable enemy because they will not allow the U.S. to tell them what to do, to dominate their economy, and to decide their politics. That goal still remains. It's becoming even more urgent as a consensus of both parties and the media is pushing us toward another war, directly this time, with the PRC over Taiwan, which we agreed in 1979 was an internal part of China. And now we're being pushed to recognize as an independent country and station U.S. forces there, which will trigger another war. And I'll speak more about that later. The U.S. People's Friendship Association stands for cultural and personal contacts, and we here in Southeast Michigan are trying to revive that early anti-imperialist spirit. When China was, when Americans were discovering and young radicals were discovering that they have a kindred spirit and they have allies among the Chinese people, and to bring contacts between us as teachers with China. I'll speak more about how we tend to do this, but I believe there's a tremendous necessity right now to form those contacts, to send those groups again, to meet with our colleagues in China and to talk about how we prevent this war that's coming up, on behalf of our people and of the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Wow. Today. So this is very exciting to learn about China, and obviously we're going to have another program dealing specifically with China, and hopefully Steve will help us with that too. Same with our next guest. This issue I'm sure we know very little about, the Philippines. I do know that it was one of the first imperialist adventures of the U.S. I know that much. And that makes us over 100 years strong as the world imperialist power. And I'm sure our guest is going to talk about them. But our guest's name is MIXX, M-I-X-X, Hernandez. And MIXX mentioned to me that it's difficult for him to divide the first and second question. So I'm going to do something different here. We're just going to let you answer this question for 5 minutes and begin the next question for 5 minutes. So you have 10 minutes to talk about both questions if you want to.
No pressure at all. No pressure. Thanks.
Up to 10 minutes. Okay. So the second question before MIXX starts is about terminology. The question about how we're all getting confused about what imperialism means and what is the left. I mean, who's the left, who's the right, and what's democracy. And I mean, all these words have all been diluted and changed and morphed into other meanings. Some of them turned into the opposite. I mean, when I saw Yeltsin stand in front of a tank in the Soviet Union, he was called a revolutionary. And for those of us who struggle for a revolution, we know he was a counter-revolutionary. But it depends who's talking, who's calling someone in some sense. So we're going to try to address that and clear some of those words up if we can, especially imperialism. But if you want to address that too in this time slot, that'd be great. So let's give a nice welcome to MIXX from the Filipino Youth Bureau.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. Just want to introduce myself again. I'm MIXX Hernandez. I'm an organizer with ANAKBAYAN Detroit General Defense Committee, and I work with Detroit Eviction Defense as well. So he already gave me the disclosure. I made a little note here to make that disclosure. And I also want to apologize. I live on Red Bulls and granola bars, so I might be a little shaky as I try to talk today. Yeah, so let's talk about ANAKBAYAN, which is the organization that I'm representing today. ANAKBAYAN USA is an international chapter of ANAKBAYAN Philippines. And we have 30 chapters across the country. We also have chapters in Canada, Europe, and basically anywhere you can find us. ANAKBAYAN is a comprehensive national democratic mass organization comprised of Filipino youth, workers, and students. ANAKBAYAN derives from two Filipino words. Anak means children, and bayan means, it can be defined as people or nation. So we are basically the children of the people. And we see ourselves as members of ANAKBAYAN as children of the people, and we're here to serve the people. Yeah, so other than that, ANAKBAYAN is part of a broader national liberation struggle in the Philippines, and the national liberation struggle in the Philippines is specifically called the National Democratic Struggle with a socialist perspective. We were born out of the history of the first Great Rectification movement through Kabataang Makabayan, which is known as the Patriotic Youth, and it was founded by Jose Maria Sison, also the founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines, in the 1960s during the U.S. Marcos dictatorship. Those same youth, those same patriotic youth were actually at the forefront of the resistance against martial law, which ultimately led to the People Power Revolution of 1986. And with that, I just want to say today, this weekend, is actually the 37th anniversary of our People Power Revolution. So I just want to put that out there, and I'm glad to be here representing my people's struggle today. And we are guided principally through the principles of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, due to the particularities of the Philippines. And I noticed there was a question here about what is our position on the left relative to other groups. So considering we're in the US, I want to explicitly say that we are not a US left group. So our analysis is specifically according to the particularities of our motherland. We're part of a broader national liberation movement that exists here in the US now because of the neo-colonial relationship between the US and the Philippines. And our aim is to organize overseas Filipino workers, immigrants, and Filipinos in the diaspora. We aim to educate the masses about the fact that we are here now in the belly of the beast because of imperialism. We are here because of the existing unequal economic relationship between the US and the Philippines, which keeps the Philippines an import-dependent, export-oriented economy, also relying on the exportation of labor and commodification of the Filipino workers. This is all despite the fact that based on the US intelligence assessment, the Philippines may have untapped minerals between $840 billion to $1 trillion. Despite the fact that we are the 8th largest rice producer in the world, yet we're still forced to import our own rice. Despite the fact that our land is rich in natural resources like copper, gold, iron, lumber, and a lot more, but we don't even have our own way of manufacturing our own finished products because that's how US imperialism has set up the Philippines to be, so we can be reliant completely with the US economy. So with how we address anti-imperialism, specifically in the National Democratic Movement, we do recognize and respect the fact that there are people in the armed struggle. We recognize that this is the primary form of struggle. We understand that, especially under the violence that we face under US imperialism, what else can we do? US imperialism necessitates armed struggle. It necessitates resistance. It necessitates violence as well. And that's a harsh reality that we have to come to terms with. However, I do want to specify, because of certain things going on in the Philippines right now, our role as ANAKBAYAN is in the urban legal movement. We're working to organize and educate the masses, specifically the working class, to equip them with the tools to fight. And with that, I want to emphasize that we don't see reformism as the main solution, but we do participate in the parliamentary struggle so we can build a broader movement to build a stronger united front against imperialism. And I believe the second question was, describe how you define relevant terms. I think most of us here already have a definition in our minds about imperialism, socialism, communism, capitalism, and whatnot. And then there's a question about identity politics, and class struggle. So if it's okay for me to continue, how much time do I have left?
You have about 3 minutes left.
3 minutes? Okay. So a question about identity politics and class struggle. We do approach it differently than most US-based organizations. And my answer is actually a personal answer. It doesn't reflect the entire organization. We generally see these two things. We see identity politics being weaponized against us, and we can't deny the important question of identity, and we can't deny intersectionality. I don't believe that this is completely divorced from the class struggle, so I personally don't like the question of identity politics versus class struggle. However, we do not see class as an identity. Class is a material condition. It is our material relationship to the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So we try to organize principally from the class perspective, but we do have specific sectors in our movement, like Gabriela, that organize women, workers, and peasants as well. So more working definitions with the National Democratic Analysis, we identify 3 basic problems of the Philippines, which are bureaucrat capitalism, feudalism, and imperialism. Bureaucrat capitalism, if you're not familiar with it, is defined as governing bureaucrats using their power in support of the imperialists and big landlords for their own personal wealth. Feudalism, in the context of the Philippines, are characteristics of feudalism that still exist in the Philippines under the system of capitalism to suppress our largest class, which is the peasantry. And of course, imperialism. We just basically define imperialism as late-stage capitalism, where a few monopoly capitalists have control over our economy, military, politics, and culture. So from 1900 to 1946, we were under direct colonial rule of the US. From 1946 to present time in the Philippines, we have become a semi-colony under the US. And the US continues to maintain control and influence over us through unequal policies, partnerships with our ruling elite, installing puppet governments, and using violent state forces to enforce this agenda. So US imperialism manifests itself in many ways in the Philippines. I know we want to define things, but how does it actually manifest itself? How do we experience this in the Philippines? So one of the concrete manifestations of this is the recent agreement between the Biden administration and the Philippines, which was actually just done February 2023 as well, to increase military presence in the Philippines by allowing more US military bases and joint practices that are unregulated. This is in response, as my friends here are talking about, to the increasing pressure from China and through a larger military operation to increase US military presence in Southeast Asia. So historically, the Philippines has been used as a battleground for imperialists. We saw this happen in World War II when Manila, our capital city, was left completely decimated by war, with only a tenth of the promised assistance from the US to rebuild. The US military has never left the Philippines, but they rely on semantics to say that they have no permanent bases there. They're not there, but they do have moving bases under the Visiting Forces Agreement. And not only that, the US trains our police directly in our armed forces of the Philippines or the military with this counterinsurgency. This is expressed through the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict and through the anti-terror law to continue and intensify the suppression of the people's voices. I'm trying to finish this in 30 seconds, I'm sorry. So this law identifies any form of dissent as terrorism and it allows for illegal detention of activists. It has also led to the disappearances as well as killings of activists. So as an example, just a year ago, five of our friends in the movement, who we now know as New Bataan 5, were brutally massacred last year by the AFP. And they were actually volunteer teachers and activists working towards making education accessible to indigenous communities. So they were ambushed and massacred by the AFP on their way to the mountains to serve our indigenous people. This is also part of our broader campaign in the National Democratic Movement to take back our education, to protect our indigenous schools from violent state forces. And the AFP used the anti-terror law to justify these killings, but the independent autopsy and investigation show that the formal statements made by the state were untrue. So yeah, we are once again under the US puppet government, under Marcos Jr., who is the son of the previous dictator during the US-backed dictatorship in the 70s and 80s. And this was done through the systemic miseducation of the Filipino people, historical revisionism, and through the assistance of the US with its counterinsurgency tactics. They're so nice. The militarization of state entities under the web of US imperialism intensifies the brutalization of my people. And I think it's important to address that violence is not separate from the violence that Palestine, Yemen, and many other countries face as they fight for their own liberation. Nor is it separate from the police brutality that the Black and brown communities here face every single day through the militarization of the US police force. US imperialism is not just guilty of inflicting this violence on other nations. And we need to know, it is happening right here in the belly of the beast. And we have the power to fight back.
Great. Thank you, Mitch. Beautiful. All right, so I know you have a lot more to say, so maybe you can fit it in the next questions too as we go along here, but we want to know more from you too. So we're obviously going to have a separate program about the Philippines also. That would be good, wonderful. Actually, we talked about having a film series, maybe at CIPIR, certainly an anti-imperialist film series. And one of the first films we're going to show is about the Philippines. It's called Amigo by John Sayles, which I'm sure you've seen. It's a beautiful explanation of how we started our imperialist ventures around the world. So we're going to ask the next panelists, the others, to follow up on that second question. I just want to clarify the question a little more. Now the left is, you have to clarify it, you have to narrow down the left by saying, no, the anti-war left. Because a lot of the left is not anti-war. They're intentionally supporting funding of Ukraine with military weapons and continuing a terrible war that's going on. A large part of the left is not anti-imperialist, and some are not even anti-capitalist. It's defined relative to where you are. This is one of the confusions is there's always been this choice between communism and freedom or democracy. Well, those aren't the options. I mean, you can have democracy, that's a different spectrum totally. You can have democracy or authoritarianism in any system. And communism is one system, and capitalism is another system. And if you noticed all these years, they never talked about capitalism versus communism. I always talk about freedom and democracy against who would choose. I mean, I want freedom, so that sounds good to me. So we're going to go now with, started this in with ABAYOMI. Thank you.
Well, thank you once again. And in regard to terminology, a lot of this is fostered by the corporate media. When they refer to the Democratic Party, typically they say that's the left. When they refer to the Republican Party, that is the right. But that is definitely not the case. I mean, various political traditions inside the United States have signed on to the whole historical development of this country. Beginning in the early 16th century, we had the expansion of European mercantilism, evolved into the Atlantic slave trade and colonialism. And you had Spain, there was Portugal, later the Netherlands, and then of course France and Britain all came to the Western Hemisphere to take control of the land from the indigenous people. They kidnapped, exported millions and millions of my ancestors, which of course led to the growth of world capitalism. This is well documented by some of the African American historians I mentioned earlier. People like W.B. Du Bois, people like Walter Rodney, and of course many others. So when we talk about imperialism, I mean, there's different definitions of it. Even at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, there was an anti-imperialist league that Mark Twain, the writer, was a part of. And in fact, he wrote a book entitled King Leopold's Soliloquy, which was an attack on the Belgian Congo for its atrocities, genocidal massacres of African people in what then was known as the Belgian Congo during the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Then, of course, the intervention of the socialist camp, particularly V.I. Lenin, who wrote his book during World War I entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where he talks about the supremacy of international finance capital as being the major source of imperialism during the age of industrialization. Kwame Nkrumah, some 45 years later, wrote a book entitled Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, looking at the impact of international finance capital in Africa, saying that being the U.S. being the major source of international finance capital and consequently being the major and mortal enemy of the liberation of Africa and other oppressed peoples around the world. So it has gone through a developmental stage, and as far as being anti-imperialist, we have to question, each military intervention, whether it's direct or whether it's by proxy in regard to what we see today in Ukraine. And the right will play this against the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party will play it against the Republican Party. But they converge at certain levels. For example, in the last few days, there's been discussion about further investigation into the China lab leak theory in regard to the origins of COVID-19. Does that sound familiar? That was one of the talking points of the previous administration of Donald Trump. Now we hear the Biden administration saying the same thing, and we know the reason why they're pushing these theories is to further alienate people in this country, at least an attempt to alienate people in this country from China. The whole China balloon hoax. There's never any evidence that this balloon imposed any threat to the United States and its people. There have been 3 other devices taken down, yet there's no information in that regard. So, all this saber rattling by the U.S. in regard to Ukraine, against Moscow, as it relates to Taiwan, in relationship to the People's Republic of China, is only designed to further hype up the people inside this country to make them prepared to engage in another permanent war, this time against Russia and against China. And we have to reject that. And people, even in the United States, there was Associated Press poll that was released last week that showed that only 48% of people in the United States now support an open-ended policy of funding a military conflict in Ukraine against Russia. So maybe that'll give some people on the left some political strength to maybe start speaking out against the war. Because quite frankly, many of them ran for cover last year when the war broke out.
Thank you. Thank you, ABAYOMI. That's great. Let's hear it. Now we're going to have our next guest, Steve, address that question.
History is littered with empires, but when we talk about imperialism, we're usually referring to the march of European colonialism, which was so ably presented, from Europe to Africa and the Americas, to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and finally China. And by the time imperialism got to China, it turned what had been one of the most prosperous and most efficiently, if not fairly governed country in the world into a horrible example of poverty, starvation, and deprivation. That's what happened to China over the course of the 19th century because of imperialism. The average life expectancy in China in 1949 was 35 years. That's what you got to look forward to. After the war, of course, the empires vanished and neo-imperialism replaced it. And whereas America had been the friend of China during the age of the spheres of influence and colonialism, they pioneered the neo-imperial New World Order. Not overt colonies, but former colonial possessions totally ad hoc corrupted to their former colonial masters that enriched the mother countries with the raw materials, and their people suffered under intense corruption and lack of opportunity. China said no. China had a choice to unite itself and integrate itself with American capitalism or to pursue a different route. They hoped to be a partnership with the Soviet Union and to build something new, build something different, to fulfill the promises of the Chinese Revolution, which began in 1911 under these three simple principles. Sun Min Tzu Yi, that the people of China should rule China, that the government should serve the people, and that the purpose of government was to allow the people to grow and to develop and to flourish. And that the judgment of history, the opinion of the Chinese Revolutionary Movement was that could not happen until China was independent of everyone, and that includes the United States. And their cardinal sin from 1949 on is that they rejected American domination. Even when communism started to fray, we cannot tell China what to do. We will never tell them what to do. That's not the way it works for them. And if we don't like it, quite frankly, they don't care. Because China has been under the domination of other powers, and their people suffered unimaginably. In 1949, they stood up, and they're not going back. And we as a people have a choice whether to try to use this notion of China as a new enemy, the new mortal threat, the new evil empire to justify a war, or to respect the fact that it's their country, that is their culture, and they will have to address their problems in their way, because we're not going to tell them what to do. Imperialism in its late stage now has the risk of nuclear war. And I guess it's incumbent upon all of us to do what we can in this country to stop that and to reject imperialism. And now it's time for our people to stand up.
Thank you, Steve Boyce, and now we're going to hear from Catherine Wilkerson.
I've been thinking a lot about leftism. And we think that we know what it means, but when we really try to explain it, that's a whole different question. I would submit that a leftist cannot be pro-war. I don't think that's leftism, and I'm going to say why. I see leftism as a wing of politics that seeks to change the status quo and the power relations of society. And that can either be through reformism or it can be through revolution. And when I look at the war that's the United States and NATO are conducting against Russia in the Ukraine, I see an effort to reinforce the power relations in society, not to disrupt them at all. And I think that you can't say that you are in favor of changing the power relations of society and support a war that seeks to absolutely strengthen that. And so that's one of the reasons that I would say that there are no true leftists that are pro-war. I think of leftism as being collectivism, as opposed to individualism. I think of leftism as being putting the needs of the many over the needs of the few. I think of leftism as being a set of political orientation and beliefs in which the necessities of life are to be provided to everyone. And that is certainly not consistent with what we're seeing in the course of this war or any other imperialist war that the United States has been guilty of masterminding over the years. I think that also this war is incredibly destructive to the environment. The environment is a collective good. It is a common good. And people who are on the left do not want to see a common good destroyed for imperialist gain and capitalist gain, which this war is designed to accomplish, to eliminate rivals to U.S. hegemony. So that's kind of what I've been thinking a lot about with regard to what it means to me to call myself a leftist. And I know that that may not be what everybody thinks, but that's what it means in my view. I think of it also with regard to the global pandemic, that leftists recognize that it is our obligation to protect the most vulnerable among us, both within the United States and all around the world. And the people all around the world, as well as many groups within the United States, have been sacrificed for the profits of the pharmaceutical corporations and for the continuing functioning of the capitalist order. This has been an enormous failure, in my view, of leftists as well. And I think that you can't be a leftist and not believe that we need to take care of one another during a global pandemic. So I think I'll just finish with that and go to the next question.
Thank you, Kathy. Great, this is good. I'm enjoying this. Okay, so just a little short story about the term progressive. I forgot about that word. That's another word. Okay, so I've been writing a film column for like 40, 50 years. When I first started, I called it progressive cinema, just to be more open in general to most people. Most progressives, people I hung around with, but we never defined where does progressive end and this start and all that sort of stuff. Until people started asking me, what do you mean by progressive? And then I had to start defining it. I said, well, actually, I knew where I was politically. I was to the left there. And I said, well, maybe I think it's everybody past the Democrat Party. In other words, anti-capitalist. I guess I define it. If you don't support this system, then you're progressive. But no, then I found a lot of capitalists who call themselves progressive and worked with our group, our film club. And the term got very vague. And so over the years, I never changed the term, but I realized that all these words really have many different meanings to them. We're never going to agree with everybody, as I mentioned earlier, on every issue. So how do you live with someone you don't agree with, or how do you work with someone you don't agree with? 100%. How do you work with each other when you have major disagreements in some areas? Like this last issue, we had a lot of arguments about the Rage Against the War Machine rally in D.C. Among our group, the U.S. Peace Council decided not to endorse the event, although we were all given the right to, if you individually you want to go and support it, that's fine. But some groups did not chose not to endorse it, like Medea Benjamin showed up at it, but Code Pink refused to endorse it. So this raised the question of exactly, because they didn't agree with some of the speakers and some of the groups who represent libertarians, the LaRouche group and all. I mean, there's so many ways to divide people. And there's reasons, you know, there's good and bad politics. So do you work with people who half of their politics you agree with, the other half you can't agree with, like they're horrible? So that's the question. How do you form coalitions and be successful? You know, where do we go from here? How do we build the anti-imperialist movement, which they tried to do last week in DC? And now where there's going to be another rally for the other side in March. And I hope you all can go to that one. That'll be a good one too. So I think I'm addressing that. Where do we go from here with this struggle against imperialism? It's a tough question, and I know you have 5 minutes, so here we go.
The classic novel by Chernyshevsky says it all, Что делать, which means what is to be done. What is to be done from the perspective of our organizing committee for a new U.S.-China People's Friendship Association is to forcefully confront the political consensus that China is a mortal enemy of the United States and the growing consensus for war on both the Democrats and the Republicans. To confront the incessant media propaganda showing that a Chinese balloon is a existential threat to the United States, but us sending spy planes over their military bases is just fine. It is to once again forge direct people's contact between teachers in the United States and teachers in China. How do we present your country? How do you present ours? And how do we work together for peace? Not just in China, but also in Taiwan. If you think everyone in Taiwan wants to declare independence and become the 51st state, you are wrong. They're not insane. And the party that wants to do that lost heavily in the last election because their whole campaign was based on demonizing China, and it just doesn't work. If you want to believe that China is just another imperialist superpower, you can do that. It's not true. If you want to believe it doesn't make any difference if we go to war with them, you can believe that too. And that is a pernicious lie. That will start another depression. That will kill God knows how many people, including people I know. We intend to send teachers to China, to Guangxi province, which is near the South China Sea, which is the headquarters of the Southern Military Command, which will no doubt be bombed by American cruise missiles when Joe Biden fulfills his pledge to aid Taiwan, a country, a province of China we do not officially recognize. I would like to see groups of young radicals again go to China to speak with their compatriots who have a vision of China which is still revolutionary, which still seeks to serve the people first and foremost, to talk about our common goals and our common ambitions and how we can help each other. The impact of people going to China when it was still our mortal enemy was huge. Now it's time to go again and to come back and to tell our people what we have seen. China is not our enemy. The Chinese people are not our enemy. The people that can't provide electricity to the town I live in, the people that can't provide rail safety and poisons the people of East Palestine, Ohio, ignored by the federal government in their desire to give more tanks to Ukraine, that is our enemy. And it also means taking a difficult position that if this country launches a war against the people of China, they have every right to defend themselves by any and every means necessary. Alienation is when your country's at war and you're for the other side. And that's what happened when I was a kid watching the Vietnam protesters carrying the flags of the National Liberation Front, because they were wrong. And our napalming and killing of Vietnamese women and children, that the Vietnamese fighting for independence were right. Our atrocity against their people were wrong. And that war was entirely justified. I have confidence in our ability to try and stop this. My friends in China have been fearful of this for the last 4 or 5 years, but they have told me this: China will do everything in its power to not go to war. And they will clearly, unambiguously indicate the line that the U.S. cannot cross. And if this government does it anyway, they are not afraid of the sacrifice that that will entail.
Do you mind if I pass this on like my thoughts? Just a little heavy.
I would just piggyback onto what Steve was saying, is that U.S. imperialism has to be defeated in the Ukraine. We have to accept this. It has to be defeated, because it is just going to use that to move on to the next target, which is China. And so we'll be revolutionary defeatists in the core, the imperial core, in order to try to save humanity from the ravages of U.S. imperialism. When I think of what we have to do to unite the anti-imperialist movement, I think the most important thing is to listen to and show solidarity with the victims of U.S. imperialism. And although there are many within the United States, the struggle that's going on throughout what has been called the Third World or the Global South is the most important thing, in my view, that I need to do, is to be in solidarity with those struggles that are going on, and to educate myself about them, and to not let that fall out of my vision for what I'm doing. I think that so much of the United States, even people that call themselves leftists, are focused entirely on what we're supposed to be determining should be done in the world. And this is just another kind of imperialism. There's going to have to be multipolarity in order to defeat U.S. imperialism. And that is what we're seeing all over the world, and we should be in solidarity with that. I think that the issue of uniting with the right, in my view, you cease to be a leftist if you unite with the right, and I will not do it. Some people I know disagree and will do that, and that is a decision that people are making as they analyze it. But the kind of world that we're seeking to build is not the kind of world that so many people on the right who are opposed to the war in the Ukraine are trying to build. They are not anti-imperialist. I submit that that is not an anti-imperialist stance when you're a capitalist party. You cannot be an anti-imperialist in my view. So I would say that there are many people that we can unite with, both around the world, and there are going to be a lot of them in Washington, D.C. on March 18th who share our vision for a world. I agree, we don't have to agree on every single thing, but we should have a shared vision of the world that we're trying to build and who our true comrades and allies are. And that is my particular viewpoint on Rage Against the War Machine. I think it was a flop, and the only thing good that came out of it, in my view, is that a whole bunch of groups on the left are stronger and more united in opposition to that. So that is a good thing.
Keep trying to pass it on, my bad. Sorry, it's just very invigorating to hear everybody talk about also the struggles outside of the United States, and acknowledging the fact that people in the global south are pretty much being treated like pawns to these imperialist wars. We are people, you know, and I appreciate the fact that I have the opportunity here to tell my people's stories and also connect with these other stories that are going on. So talking about anti-imperialism and what can we do, When we talk about revolutions, and I'm just gonna ramble on, when we talk about revolution, sometimes we talk about it as if it's something happening external to us. It is not just an external process. It's very important for us to address our own internal contradictions, knowing where we are right now. We have the knowledge, we have the tools. So I do believe that addressing anti-imperialism, even as an individual, means addressing yourself. What do you need to change within yourself so that you're not forced to act in a way that capitalism is forcing you to act, or, you know, and so you can also empower yourself. Because at the end of the day, internal is decisive, you know. The second thing I want to say is that organizing here in Detroit, as well as in the Philippines, has really shown me the power of the people. So when we talk about how can we come together to address imperialism, and you know, we define these things like what is leftism, different spectrums of leftism, and it's so very easy for us to be divided over these ideological differences. But at the end of the day, people are dying. You know, we are all dying, not just in other countries. People here in Detroit are dying, you know, and we need to address that. So what can we do? Honestly, I have to look at my notes. So, you know, and we're so deeply divided by these little things, could be big things sometimes. We need to really seek unity in addressing our common enemy. Who is the common enemy? We need to focus on who the main enemy is here, which is US imperialism. How can we build strength through these unities to create a stronger, broader movement exposing and imposing imperialism? So as you see, I'm not really answering this question. I'm posing questions for you to also figure out, how are we going to address this together? How can we build a broader anti-imperialist united front? How can we raise consciousness about building community and collective power? How can we dismantle the system that thrives off of all of our division and create a world that we so desperately need and deserve? We know what we deserve. So I don't think that the answer lies in any of our specific organizations' analyses or any one movement. I think the answer lies right in front of us. You know, every single day that we are with our community, every single day that we are with the people, take the time to listen and we'll find the answer, because the answer is people power.
Okay, well, if we're still talking about building unity, the first thing we have to tell the truth, and we have to know that we cannot present falsehoods and distorted information under the guise of truth. And that is very, very important. And I believe the conditions under which working people, oppressed people, youth in the United States are facing will force people together. We can see right now the narrative in regard to Ukraine is breaking down among broader segments of the United States population. I noticed in the Chinese media this morning covering demonstrations in Germany against sending weapons to Ukraine that involve thousands of people. I don't know if those people are on the left or on the right, or perhaps a mixture of both the left and the right. But I'm sure they realize they're cold in Western Europe. And as far as the UK, you know, I've gotten reports of people who don't have adequate heat in their flats, in their apartments, because of the energy crisis that's going on as a direct result of US and NATO policy in regard to Ukraine and Russia. I think that if we point out, once again, being African American History Month, we look back at the role of China, for example. W.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned earlier, a leading African American historian and sociologist and activist, went to China with Shirley Graham Du Bois, his wife, in 1959. After his passport had been held up for nearly a decade by the United States government. In 1950, he was indicted by the federal government for supposedly being an agent of a foreign ideology. What was that foreign ideology? He did not want a war between the United States and China and the United States and Russia and for opposing the U.S. invasion of the Korean Peninsula in 1950. That was his crime. After a long legal and political battle, they were awarded passports. So they immediately went to the socialist countries at that time in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, and also to the People's Republic of China. And the Du Bois met with the Chinese leadership at the time, under Mao Zedong and the others. And they wrote about this even in the New York Times. In 1963, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, 60 years ago this year, when we had the assassination of Medgar Evers, there was the bombing of the Birmingham church by the Ku Klux Klan, the largest, up until that time, civil rights march in the U.S. took place right out here down Woodward Avenue, hundreds of thousands of people in 1963. The Chinese government issued 2 statements in support of the civil rights movement and the African American struggle. Robert F. Williams, people may have forgotten him. He was at one time an NAACP chapter leader in Monroe, North Carolina. He did not believe in nonviolent resistance. He believed in self-defense, not aggressive violence, but self-defense. And he was run out of North Carolina. He was run out of the United States. He went to Cuba for a number of years, and then eventually he went to the People's Republic of China. There are many other examples of solidarity between China and the African American struggle. In 1968, after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Chinese government issued a statement of solidarity amid rebellions in over 100 cities in this country in response to Dr. King's assassination. They issued a statement, and all these documents can be found online now. You can look them up. If you don't believe what I'm saying, you can look them up yourself. So I just wanted to make the point that we have to look at these historical developments from various perspectives. And in regard to Ukraine, the falsehood has been pushed is that the war began a year ago this week. They don't talk about the expansion of NATO. They don't mention the Obama administration's overthrow of the previous government of Yanukovych in 2014. It was a deliberate interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine in order to push it further into the NATO camp. The bombing of trade unionists in Odessa in 2015. And people want to argue with us about whether or not the special military operation is justified, yet they don't want to talk about what happened in 2014. They don't want to talk about any of these issues except what they see and hear through the corporate media and the government-controlled media. So we have to tell the truth about what is actually going on in China, in Ukraine, and other parts of the world.
Thank you, ABAYOMI. And by the way, talking about corporate media, ABAYOMI writes for the non-corporate media, and we want to read your style. You're constantly seeing us the Black Agenda report. I saw your report this morning. As I got up, I saw his name on their site. ABAYOMI is a ferocious activist and a great writer. Appreciate your work. And what great speakers, such knowledge and feelings. We appreciate it from all of you. Thank you. So we're going to do, let's give them all a nice round of applause. Let me actually introduce you to the person who's going to be heading this Q&A session. It's our dear friend, Linda Rayburn. She's going to come on up, Linda. Linda's our co-chair of Michigan Peace Council.
So Q&A, who would love to ask a question?
My name's Cameron. I'm with the Detroit Club of the Communist Party USA. And my question for you guys is, what is to be made about the fascistic right wing, best exemplified by the so-called Freedom Caucus, filling the void in the political mainstream for a genuine anti-war movement? These people, these fascists, frankly, are outflanking folks like Barbara Lee, the Democratic Socialists, and now the Libertarian Party is playing a prime organizing factor in the political mainstream of opposing this war. So I'm wondering, what do we as the socialist left, what is to be made about this? And where does the energy from this libertarian fascistic right-wing thing go? Is it gonna, everyone's just gonna repeal Social Security and Medicare now? Like, where's this gonna go? So that's my question for you guys. Thank you.
Well, let me just say this, as has been echoed by others in this panel, I don't see the feasibility of a right-left alliance on Ukraine at this point, because if you scratch beneath the surface of these organizations, were they in favor of overturning the results of the 2020 election? Did they support the storming of the Capitol on January 6th of 2021? Do they support anti-racist political policies? Are they against the prison industrial complex that enslaves over 2 million people here in the United States? These are the kind of discussions we need to have, you know, with people who are calling for a right-left alliance against Ukraine. I think it shows, you know, the failure of many on the left in this country last year to see this war for what it actually was. And they were very quick, some of them, to denounce Russia, to, in fact, even play down the fascist, neo-fascist elements that are driving Ukrainian policy domestically. I mean, this is a major ideological and political failure in this country. So it's going to take a lot to build unity, and it's going to take a lot. But I don't think it should be on the basis of opposition to what aspect of Ukrainian policy. If they see, most people can see that the U.S. is not winning in Ukraine. No matter how many lies they tell, all the HIMARS they've sent over there, all of the other sophisticated military equipment and trainers that they have sent over there has not made that much of a difference on the battlefield. We have been writing about this in Fighting Words on a weekly basis in terms of the progression of the war on the ground, and also the role of other NATO countries like Poland and Hungary and vis-a-vis what is happening in Ukraine. Also, we have to keep in mind that at present, the United States is in a very, very difficult situation economically. We see all these layoffs taking place in the tech sector. We see rents going up. We see mortgages going up. And there's really no policy on the part of the administration, the one that's in office, or the opposition, or at least half opposition, because they now control the U.S. House of Representatives. But I don't hear any real thinking in regard to how do we deal with these issues. The housing crisis, the crisis of energy, the crisis of interpersonal violence in this country, the crisis of racist violence in the United States and misogyny. I don't hear any real concrete discussion on this. So these are the issues we need to talk about. You know, the U.S. is failing in Ukraine. They're lying to us on a daily basis. So some people will, you know, want to say at this point, we shouldn't send over $100 billion to Ukraine. And then they tell us in a few months that they're running out of ammunition. They need F-16s right now. They need this, they need that, and the other. So, no, I don't think at this point, I don't see any basis for that, and that it's important that people try to unite based on principle.
So first of all, I want to criticize something. If you don't mind, since you're from CPUSA, I don't think we should view anything here as a failure. To address that, I think that we know what our duties are here, knowing that we're organizers. Basically, what can we correct with our practices and how we organize and educate the people? How can we make this information and knowledge more accessible to the masses? Because it can be very intimidating for some people to try to even talk about it, because they don't know. You know, everybody's just trying to survive, and they only listen to what they see in the media. So I think that one way that we can approach it is by knowing clearly what our roles are here in our immediate community. How can we agitate the masses? How can we create the propaganda to tell the truth? Because the people deserve to know the truth. But we also need to make sure that we are meeting them at their level so that they can also understand that that they are involved actively in this struggle. It's not just, something you read on the paper. This is affecting you directly as an individual. This is affecting your family. This is affecting your community. And how can we interconnect the struggles, not just in Ukraine? How can we connect the struggles in Ukraine and Palestine and the Philippines and here in Detroit? How can we make the struggle more personal to them? It's the fact that the US spends 10 times more than any other country just to kill everybody else, while everybody else here, we don't have clean water or drinkable water. We have so many abandoned buildings. We have so many illegal foreclosures, evictions. So many things are happening here, and it's so easy. I mean, it's not really that difficult to connect that with the problems also abroad or overseas. I don't view this as a failure on our end. It's just it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity for us to reflect, self-criticize, and criticize constantly, so that we can continue to build a stronger movement together and involve other people in it, and even the people who I think sometimes we get stuck with dealing with intellectuals and academics, that we forget about the proletarians, and speaking the language of the proletarian and being able to easily just do that. They understand, they know what's going on. These are their material conditions. And it's our duty to be able to kind of raise their consciousness to that. So I don't want you to feel defeated. I know there are some cases where we can feel defeated, and that's okay. But ultimately, the fight is still on, and we are here to build a stronger united front with solidarity, international solidarity as well. So yeah, that's my answer to your question. I hope you like that.
Your question raises another question, which is even more disturbing and more problematic. Because that rally, the infamous Rage Against War rally, I call the Jimmy Dore rally. And Jimmy Dore's political position is the Democratic Party are despicable scumbags that you would never work with under any condition. Is a message I've heard from the left my entire adult life. Right? They're despicable, imperialist scumbags, you should never work with them. And he's taken that to heart, which means, it's okay to vote to work with the other side. Now, if you do believe that the Republican Party is in fact increasingly the party of neo-fascism, then that raises an uncomfortable question and you will never work with the Democrats because they're pro-imperialist scumbags, then you're fucked. Because there's nobody else left. So let's look at Chairman Mao Zedong and his famous work on contradiction. Are there contradictions that we can exploit? And are there things which can turn into their opposite? So Ro Khanna is a so-called progressive Silicon Valley Democrat. The latter part is true, the first part is a lie. How do I know it's a lie? Because the working class people of East Palestine, Ohio, voted 70% for Trump. And next time they'll probably vote 90% because the president didn't go there, he's in Ukraine. Secretary of Transportation didn't go there, he's running for president. And Donald Trump shows up and bought them all McDonald's. So the first point is, why and how in hell did the Democratic Party, the party of FDR and the New Deal, lose the white working class? Because they did. And now that it's gone, it's being replaced by the forces that you talked about. And what are we going to do about that? And so my position is, Democrats are leftist imperialist scumbags. But you know what? I'm glad Ro Khanna is in China right now, because he doesn't want a war, and neither do I. And that means we need a degree of finesse, which is hard to implement in person, in reality, and make those decisions. Catherine spoke very eloquently against a red-brown coalition. And there are dangers there. There are absolute dangers there. And I don't really worry about progressive party as much because it's a family operation and they're weird. But I do worry that if we always write off Democrats, then there's no levers of power that we can influence. And that's going to require some influence to stop this war. And that's what I'm concerned about. So if you really believe that we are facing a fascist threat, then maybe we have to be a little more sophisticated about dealing with imperialist scumbags.
I'll be brief. I just want to directly respond to your question about where is this leading. Everybody already has heard where I stand about the Rage Against the War Machine event and the Libertarian Party. I think if you look at the 10 demands, everybody says these are good demands, but you need to look at them a little bit more closely. When they say that they want to decrease military spending and put money back in the pockets of Americans, what are they talking about? They're talking about cutting taxes so that they can eliminate Medicare, so that they can eliminate Social Security, so they can eliminate regulations that would protect people in East Palestine, Ohio, from the kind of catastrophe that occurred, so that they can eliminate licensure for doctors. I couldn't believe that one. I'm a doctor and I'm thinking, oh, so you don't even need to have a license if you're supporting their policies? It's a very, very dangerous path that we could be going down. And that, in my view, was the purpose of the Rage Against the War Machine, was to advance a right-wing agenda in the United States, not to stop the war. They know they're not going to stop the war. They know that they're trying to advance their right-wing agenda. And I don't think they did all that well, so that's the good news.
Thank you, panelists, for that. Yes, we have some more questions. Welcome. So who is next? We would love to speak. Thank
Hello,
you.
my name is Derek Grigsby, and thank you guys. I really appreciate you, young lady. Saying some good stuff. I want to catch you guys before you leave, so bear with me. Fighting Words Forum, I want to invite you guys. March 11th, we're having a forum in defense of Russia. It's called In Defense of Russia, against the U.S. NATO proxy war in Ukraine. You can get some flyers from over there on the table, or talk to David Soul. Also want to invite you guys, this is an announcement, also want to invite you guys to a March 18th National Day of Protest. I think this is something that's been organized nationally, and we want to do something here in Detroit. So come on out for that. That's on March 18th at 2 p.m. in Hart Plaza. So we already have a date for that. Okay. Okay, so that's about it. So we're having a march. We're having a march or a rally, a day of protest on March 18th. And we're also having a forum on March 11th at 59 22nd Avenue. If I did say that, you guys probably know where that is. It's been there for over 20 years, and it's the only thing, all kind of no war signs and everything in the window, so that's great. It's a beautiful place. When I tell people about it, they're like amazed. But okay, so come on out. And this is an answer to how we get together, how we create unity. We got to stop being sectarianism, or being sectarian, and come on out. A lot of times I go to events and I ain't gonna be long. A lot of times I go to events and we just don't have the participation. We're all split up, going to little group things, and it's just one enemy. It's just a lot of different issues. But yeah, so come on out. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. Are there flyers in the back? Okay, if you did not receive them, come and get some from David.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Simmons. I'm 81, long-time Detroiter. And as I look around, it just occurred to me that I don't see many black and brown people here. That's a problem because we're in a city that has such a large black and brown population. And I think that one of the reasons why they're not here is because whatever we call ourselves. we're not doing enough for the things that some of you have discussed. For example, my utility bill went up, has doubled the past few months. Lots of other people are, and another thing, I was standing in the grocery store and they're raising the prices while I'm standing there. Now, we got some serious problems domestically that everybody in Detroit is already worried about. Many people don't know anything about the truth that we're telling about Ukraine right now, or about international affairs. And there's a reason for that. We've been taught as a society that international affairs is something that's reserved for people who are experts, for people who are highly educated, they study that. Other people are not supposed to get involved in that. But we do know about our utilities and our food. So let's start there, building with those organizations that are already working on domestic issues. And let's introduce the idea, while we're working on it with them to help them eat and have heat, then let's talk about, teach them about the international affairs and show the relationship between war, imperialism, and the fact that I don't have any food. Let's start where we already have strength and build on that. Now, I feel a lot of discouragement now among activists. And we need to remind ourselves of what we have already achieved. And I see some gray-haired folks up here. I know you all remember the Vietnam War, the anti-apartheid movement. Those were movements that were successful because of grassroots people organizing, people just like folks in here. And some of us were involved in that. We took on, NATO actually was the enemy of South Africa, was the enemy of anti-colonialism. They didn't announce it as NATO at that time, but it was the European machine, white settler governments fighting against colonialism all over Africa. But the students here, the students in Europe and all around the world, forced the universities to pull their money out of these corporations and banks that were supporting South Africa and apartheid. The churches, a lot of the churches they pulled their money out of the system that was supporting the apartheid. They built camps on the campuses, all sorts of things that we did. Trade unions were involved. So we need to think about what we have already done to give us strength and patience about what we have to do right now, although we're fighting on all fronts, but we've always been fighting on all fronts as activists. This is not new. And so there are things that we can do right now, but I would say let's get involved in let's lift up the domestic struggles and then incorporate the global struggles in the domestic issues. And I want to thank you all, you great people, for telling the truth up here, because that's, as Amilcar Cabral said, who's the leader of the struggle in Guinea South. Be honest with the people. Tell them the truth. Tell no lies and claim no easy victories. It's a hard struggle, but we can win it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment. It is very concerning to me when I see organizing spaces with no representation from a majority Black city. And that also shows like some course corrections that we may need to do as well with, organizing and building the movement here. And you're right, we should be addressing what's happening here. What are the material conditions of the people here right now? What are the urgent needs of the people here right now? And since Derek plugged in some things, so just plugging in as well, the Detroit Eviction Defense, working on home defense, Moratorium Now Coalition, working on a lot of issues. The Detroit Tenants Association is also there. There's a reparations discussion that happens every third Sunday of the month, I believe, which is open to anybody in the community that they want to, if they want to participate in it. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your comment as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And, we've attempted to do this, over the years to strike a balance, between domestic issues, such as racism, national oppression, the housing crisis, and racial profiling, police brutality, and all that, to the point where now we've even been sued, by some landlords here in this area. So obviously they're quite pissed off at us, about what we're doing. So, but we do see the link between the domestic struggles and the struggles that take place on international level, because the very reason why these domestic issues cannot be addressed is because of, the funding of the Pentagon, the funding of the banks, the militarization of the police. We got this Cop City project in Atlanta, right here in the city of Detroit. The city council, they can only agree on one thing. Well, two things: to give more money to the corporations and to give more money to the police. If you go to them, you say, well, hey, the retirees need a $1,400 stipend to counteract inflation over the last year. They say, we don't have the money, we don't have the authority. But if you say, oh, the police are leaving because they're not making enough money, okay, where do we sign? More money for the police. More money for Dan Gilbert and the others.
Just real quick, during the Cold War, the media always distinguished between the Soviet government and the Russian people. Soviet government was evil, Russian people were long-suffering. That distinction was never made between China and the Chinese people. The Time magazine cover showed Mao as this fanatic and the Chinese people as locusts following him. The growing tension between the media and the ruling class in China has resulted in and will result in more assaults on Chinese people in this country. And that will get worse and worse and worse. And what you will see, it happened in World War II with the Japanese. It happened with a grad student at the University of Indiana who was attacked on a bus by a woman screaming that you were a threat to our country. You bet, there's a connection. One of the leaders of our group in Ann Arbor said, I brought my family here 50 years ago because I thought they would be safe. I no longer feel safe on the streets of America. He's crime, he's Chinese.
Yep.
I don't know, I guess I'm in a talking mood today. It's the Red Bulls. Yeah, also, I guess, since you're talking about the connections of what's going on here, yeah, I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware, but during the Philippine-American War, the genocide happened that killed about 1 million Filipinos, and of course the Western media did not talk about that. But during that war, a lot of the black soldiers saw how Filipinos were being treated while they were in the Philippines, and a lot of them did defect onto the Filipino side. So there is a very solidarity is strong. Our struggles are all interconnected, and we definitely need to build this fight together. That's it.
Yeah, I just want to say, I agree with never unite with the right wing political figures. That's a no-go. But I'm also a little, maybe a little bit more unsure about the Democratic Party as well. So just because they show that they have aligned with these right-wing fascists, they've enabled these right-wing fascists. They've done this, and I guess my question is since we're defining the left, well, why so much energy on talking about the leadership, from two bourgeois parties, and why not talk about power from the people, strike action, demonstrations, rallies? Must we have a coalition with these bourgeois actors, or should the power not come from community action, from strike action, and to add on to that question, what is to be done of the proletariat, the industrial workers, the service workers that are buying in to these right-wing fascists? Should we surrender them to these leaders? Because I don't know, it's something we haven't spoken about. I work with a lot of people that follow Trump. I work with they're working people. So is the solution to surrender them to the right-wing fascists that we say we shouldn't work with? Or should we not be making a broad working coalition? Thank you.
I really love the passion and the anger that you have there, because it's valid. It's valid. Like, why do we have to work with these forces that are also involved in our oppression? And I think that's when I was talking about earlier, like, we need to be able to identify our clear roles here let's say in the revolution, there are people who are willing to do that, but know principally that that is not probably the way for a revolution. But there are people out there who are willing to work in the legal side of things, and there are people who are not willing to do that. So how can we, I don't think that we should force ourselves to do it if it's really not within it's not aligned with your principles and values. So for example, for me, with ANAKBAYAN being an urban legal movement, if there's something specifically that I don't want to, work on with a politician or a legislator, then, that's also something to be talked about. But you're right. We should not rely on these bourgeois institutions to give us the revolution. They're never going to do that. It's time for us to reclaim that power. And then when you're talking about what are we going to do with these proletarians who are siding with Trump or identify more with the right, well, during the elections against with Clinton and Trump, Clinton did a really good job alienating the white working class, or just the working class by calling them deplorables. And it's important for us to understand, it's important for us to understand the language. That's why I was saying earlier, what is the language that the masses use? How can we win them over? I think if we spend more time listening, then we'll be able to identify who are people we can work with to bring over to our side, and who are people who are just completely close to it. I don't want you to give up completely on your coworkers. There's still some wiggle room there sometimes for change, but there are people you just cannot, just don't exert that much energy with. So that's just my answer to that question.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say it does become difficult. There are people who I cannot talk to about what's going on in Ukraine because they have drank the Kool-Aid of the Pentagon and the Biden administration. So, they think Russia is the worst, enemies of the people in the world. So, if Joe Biden says that Russia is the enemy, then if they oppose Joe Biden, that will help the Republican Party. So this is the type of circular arguments. So I try to avoid those arguments and just try to point to the facts. And that's all we can do, I think, at this point.
Thank you so much, ABAYOMI. Alrighty, everyone, thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to the panelists? And just one more round of applause for ourselves for being here today, because this is a part of the struggle, is actually being able to have these open discussions and dialogue. Alrighty, well, I guess I'm going to hand it over to Bill before we end. But before I hand it over, I just want us to think about, we talk about the war also being here. And as this being African American Month, I just want us to think about, heart of the city of Detroit and everything that most of the people that have lived here before Detroit has started to come back up and moving. And maybe take this time to think about reaching out or speaking to Detroiters here and their experience. And also learning, keeping our ears open, making sure that we can stay open to what they have to say, what they have to offer. And I just want to talk about really quickly regarding a lot of what we're discussing about organizing and fighting. My generation, I'm in the middle, in between. I feel like, I think we're learning from all of you, and the best that I'm trying to learn from this is how can we organize strategically and not just talk. So that's something I want to talk about with the youth that's here. Maybe if you want to stay a little longer, or maybe make sure that we have each other's information. But how can we start organizing strategically and also not burn out? Not burn out.
And once again, thank you to ABAYOMI, to Steve, to MIXX, and to Catherine. What a great panel. We had a great time. Look forward to the video and spread the word, and we'll have another panel soon. Have a great day. Bye.